Welcome back to Face the Nation. We also talked to former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates about the president's trip to the Middle East and more.
The Middle East may be one place where there are some real opportunities and possibilities. It's a place to do business for China, for the United States, for everybody else. The actions of Israel post the October 7th massacre by Hamas has really changed the strategic equation in the Middle East because Iran has been dramatically weakened. Iran's in a very weak place now, and if there is an opportunity to do a deal on nuclear, this is it.
You didn't really like the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, but President Trump is trying something that may be somewhat similar. What do you think has to be in it for it to really be a success?
Iran really has to stop their nuclear program. They have to stop their enrichment entirely, and they have to give up.
Entirely, not just highly enriched, all enrichment.
Entirely, and if they want to have a civil nuclear program, they need to import the uranium, the enriched uranium, to do that. But they need to get rid of the stockpile.
Would you oppose an Israeli strike with U.S. support on Iran's nuclear program?
The problem that I've had with a strike on the Iranian nuclear program is that it buys you a year or two. You're not going to be able to destroy, short of, as long as you're using conventional weapons, you cannot get at the very deeply buried parts of the Iranian nuclear program.
We're starting to see some points of friction with the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in particular. Are we at the point now where President Trump needs to publicly be clear that the war in Gaza has to end and withhold U.S. support if it doesn't?
I think it would be a very heavy political lift for the president to say he's going to cut off military supplies to Israel unless they stop in Gaza. I think he can say a lot of things in terms of putting pressure on Netanyahu to stop the war. He can put forward proposals on how humanitarian assistance and other things might go forward.
Is there a cost to this ongoing support of such a bloody war, given the projections from U.S. intelligence about the long-term recruitment among terror groups around the world because of the devastation?
I think there is a cost. I think it does provide a basis for radicalization in the region. But it is interesting to me that you're not hearing much out of the Gulf Arabs and others in terms of decrying the ongoing operations and so on.
Secretary of State Rubio said he believes that there won't be a clear read on Vladimir Putin's intentions until he sits down with President Donald Trump. You've met Putin before. Does it really take a face-to-face to judge Putin's intentions?
I'm not sure even in a face-to-face that you can judge Putin's intentions. My own view is Putin feels that he has a destiny to recreate the Russian Empire. Putin hasn't given up on any of his original goals in Ukraine. He's going to insist on occupying all 4 of the eastern provinces of the Donbass. Perpetual recognition of Russian ownership of Crimea, a pro-Russian government in Kyiv, and a Ukrainian military that looks a lot like an enhanced police force. He wants Ukraine basically to be a client state of Russia.
Would you advise President Trump not to take that face-to-face, even if Vladimir Putin was willing to do it?
I would say you need to figure out some leverage that you have going into that meeting with Putin. What can you do that puts more pressure to bear on Putin to make him believe his interests are served by not just a ceasefire, but basically at least freezing things in place?
How sustainable do you think it is for the Secretary of State to also be the National Security Advisor, the acting archivist, and the acting director of USAID?
It's interesting, a lot of people point to the precedent of when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor from 1973 to 1975. I was at the NSC during most of that period, and all I can tell you is Henry Kissinger was an absentee landlord. I mean, what made it work in that time was that Henry had a very experienced and wise deputy in General Brent Scowcroft. And Scowcroft essentially ran the NSC day to day. And Henry would appear now and then, but mainly did his Secretary of State job. So whether or not this will work, I think, depends on whether the Secretary of State has a deputy at the NSC who is very experienced, knows the interagency, and is respected and trusted by the president.
With this president, I've heard from officials, which is he does not trust National Security Council because of the history with the first impeachment. So he is suspect of a lot of people who sit there. What's the danger of that when you don't trust the people who are briefing you on some of the most sensitive national security issues or advising you?
I think it's important for people to remember the NSC is the president's personal foreign policy staff. So I think if people on the NSC, and I don't care whether they come from the State Department or CIA or the military or any place else or from the outside, on that staff, if you can't be loyal to the president, then you should leave.
What do you mean loyal?
I mean embrace his policies and do what you can to implement those policies and to ensure that the other agencies are implementing the president's policies. And when the time comes, if the time comes, that you disagree with those policies, then it seems to me it's incumbent on you to return to your agency or to leave the government. I think he has a right to expect loyalty. And my line when I was at the NSC was be loyal or be gone.
Mm-hmm. Including when it means having a different view of the last election or having family members who work in the Justice Department. I mean, there are some different definitions of loyalty.
Absolutely. If you hold views that are unacceptable to the president on things like that, like the election and so on, then you probably don't belong in his NSC staff. Maybe you belong at the State Department or at CIA or someplace, but you don't belong inside the White House complex. I think you need to give the president your honest views on things, on the subjects that you're in charge of, and it may be unwelcome to him, but he needs to hear different perspectives and different points of view. So being loyal doesn't mean pulling your punches in terms of the policy debate, but once the president's made a decision, then you have to salute.
Our full interview with Secretary Gates is on our website, our YouTube channel as well. We'll be right back. Last month, Ambassador Bridget Brink resigned from her post as America's top diplomat to Ukraine. She was the first American female ambassador in a war zone. For more, we're joined now by Ambassador Brink. Ambassador, good to have you here.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks so much for having me on.
You served this country for so many decades. What happened that made you say, I can't take it?
Well, maybe let me give you a little context. What I saw in Ukraine was horrifying. For 3 years, Russia launched missiles and drones at men, women, and children sleeping in their homes, tried to take down the energy grid for millions of Ukrainians, to take out the power, heat, and light in the middle of winter, and committed war crimes and atrocities at a level we haven't seen since World War II. I resigned from Ukraine and also from the Foreign Service because the policy since the beginning of the administration was to put pressure on the victim Ukraine rather than on the aggressor, Russia. I fully agree that the war needs to end, but I believe that peace at any price is not peace at all. It's appeasement. And as we know from history, appeasement only leads to more war.
And to be clear, you are a career diplomat. So that means you serve regardless of who is the president of the United States and what party they come from. And in fact, when you tried to leave post in January, Secretary Rubio asked you to stay on in Kyiv, as I understand it. You were there for a number of months until April. What specifically with this policy is a problem for you? Because you worked at post under the Trump administration. Was there a trigger that made you say, we're getting it so wrong?
Well, I would say it wasn't a hasty, rash decision. It was one that I took over the first 3 months of the administration. But the first sign was the Oval Office meeting.
In February, between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Yes, where I saw that our approach is to put pressure on Ukraine and not pressure on Russia.
The president and this administration's policy, as you have heard Secretary Rubio say, is just to try to get the fighting to stop. Do you see that America has leverage here?
Yes, of course we have leverage. From
Russia?
Yes, of course we do. I mean, we're the leader of the free world. I think, let's just be clear. Russia and Putin have invaded a sovereign, independent, democratic country in the heart of Europe with the help of North Korea, Iran, and China. This is fundamentally against U.S. interests. Europe, as our largest trading partner, is responsible for 16 million jobs on both continents. And having this war, or any festering unresolved war, on the margins of Europe is very bad for the United States. So what do we need to do as the United States? We need to put, together with partners and allies, pressure on Russia to end the war. And there are many ways to do this. We can put additional sanctions in the energy sector, in the banking sector. Russia's not as strong as some people say or some people think. The economy is hurting. They have 20% interest rates, 21% interest rates, 10% inflation. And so right now is the time to increase the pressure on Russia, to bring Putin to the table, not decrease it.
And we know that President Trump and President Putin have plans to speak on Monday. When you were still in Kyiv, President Zelensky called out the U.S. Embassy for what he called a disappointingly weak reaction from America following a missile attack that killed small children. He said, "You must not be afraid to call things by their names, and the U.S. is afraid to even say the word Russian when speaking about the missile that murdered children." Do you feel American officials are being censored from saying things frankly and honestly?
I mean, our job as diplomats is to reflect and represent the policy of the president and the administration. That's our job. That's what we do as professionals. And having worked for 5 different presidents, that requires reflecting that policy that's made constitutionally by the president. So to me, the real question is, how are we going to help to end this war in a way that's in the interest of the United States? And to do that, it can't be peace at any price. It has to be a peace that does things that advance our own interests. And those are really simple. It's how to keep Ukraine free, how to deter Russia, and how to send the right signal to China. And this is what we should be doing. And every step that we make in diplomacy, I think, should try to help achieve this goal.
And call things what they are.
It's important for us as a leader of the free world, again, to be clear and accurate. And also, I think it's an important moment in history. We've seen the devastation that happens when we appease aggressors, and we do not want to do that again. So my strong advice in terms of how to deal with Putin and Russia is not to give a single meeting or concession or legitimacy until Putin agrees to an unconditional ceasefire that's verifiable and moves forward toward a just and lasting peace. On that basis, I can see a conversation and diplomacy that can achieve our interests.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brink, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. We're joined now by retired General Stanley McChrystal, whose new book is On Character, Choices That Define a Life. Good morning to you.
Thanks for having me up, Margaret.
So you write that character is a choice built upon our deeply held beliefs. And it sounds like you really think there's a lack of it these days. We certainly see there's a loss of trust in many of our country's institutions, whether it's the federal government, journalism, the courts. How do you describe our national character right now and the leaders we have?
I think it's confused. If you look at polling, as you just referred to the lack of trust, like 22% of Americans a year ago had trust in the U.S. government. Only 34% had trust in other Americans. So I think we all sort of intuitively know we have a real problem. But what I would argue is our national leaders are not the cause of the problem. They're the symptom of the problem. The cause is us at our individual level, our unwillingness to think about character, to talk about character, and to demand character. And I would also argue that we're also the cure. There is a symptom that we see and we're distracted by it, all the things that we are disappointed by, people lying, people doing things that we find beneath us. As a nation, our character is our fate. And so what I'm trying to do is convince people to start a national conversation on character with the idea it starts at the bottom, not at the top. We need to start it down where things actually happen, on farms, in schools. We've just sent out 240 copies of the book to college sports coaches to try to have them start just to talk about character. And so that's what I'm passionate about.
Well, I admire the effort. It's interesting to look at where this began, not pinning it on a person. Sure. I understand you're trying to do that. But is it a symptom of it's always been this way, we just have more transparency, and thus we know more about people's flaws? Why does this seem to be building as a problem?
Well, we've always had a problem with certain evil in society and corruption, lack of character. But I think the fact that we see everything so much now, we normalize it. Mm-hmm. We start to accept things in celebrities or leaders that I frankly think we wouldn't have accepted even a generation ago. And that's sort of our problem. We give them our likes on social media, we spend our money with them, we vote for them, and we know better than that. And so I think the responsibility, again, arcs back to us.
You're not a Democrat or Republican, you say.
Right.
Though you did endorse Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the last elections. Most retired military try to stay out of politics and make an argument that that's crossing the Rubicon in some ways.
Yeah.
Why did you?
Well, of course, you go back to Dwight Eisenhower and Ulysses S. Grant. They absolutely went into politics.
Fair.
So there is some tradition, but that was not my goal to get into politics. I just felt that we had hit a period in which we were so adrift as a nation in terms of character. We were accepting something that is not as good as we are capable of. Mm-hmm. So I made a decision, and I'll be honest, it was tough because there's a lot of pushback from peers and from outsiders that say you shouldn't get political. But I don't think that saying that America should stand up for its values and for its character is necessarily political.
And we had in the past conversations with other guests that question about what does America stand for and does it matter? There is a shift more towards pragmatism or what's in it for me on the national scale. That's very much in our politics right now.
And I think it's a mistake for the nation. If you think what really helped the United States in the modern era, we'll call it after World War II, people admired American ideas. They admired American democracy. They admired our social, our culture. They didn't like every part of it, and they knew that we as a nation made mistakes. But countries and people wanted to be more like us than they wanted to be like the Soviet Union or other enemies. And as long as we are an example that people want to be, it gives us extraordinary influence and power. When it becomes transactional, when we become somebody that just wants something from them, and we're unwilling to be generous, we're unwilling to sacrifice for larger ideals, we lose some of our moral standing, and I think some of our national force, our power.
At the Pentagon right now, we hear a lot about values and culture sort of being at odds with the mission, or that's how it's being described, right? Secretary Hegseth has talked a lot about restoring the warrior ethos. That's part of his justification for eliminating diversity programs, or DEI. Do you think DEI really, quote unquote, hurts lethality?
Yeah, I am completely aligned with Secretary Hegseth on the idea that we need to defend the nation, that the Defense Department needs to be as effective as it can be, and that a certain warrior ethos matters. We just define it differently. In my experience, we tend to understand that everybody can contribute, particularly in today's modern wars. The idea that everybody's got to look a certain way, got to have biceps of a certain size, has got to be a male, straight, all these things is not my experience. In the counterterrorist fight, where much of my experience was it became a meritocracy. You didn't care what somebody looked like or how old they were, what their gender was or sexual orientation, because it was too important to get the job done. And I would argue now America needs to harness talent from every corner of our society. Everyone. I would even argue that if we went back to a draft, we could draft people with physical disabilities, because much of what we do, that's not a block to that. And so I think we need to think about what do we need to field the most effective armed forces. And I think that the DEI thing is frankly a distraction. It's not helpful.
In terms of national character, when you were commanding forces, the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan, ISAF, you know very well that country. The Taliban since taken over. We have seen them strip women and girls of even the right to have their voice heard in public. You have seen them carry out retribution against Afghans who worked with our country and put their lives at risk. This past week, the Trump administration said Afghanistan's safe enough for people living here to go back. They stripped the legal protections, the temporary protected status. They are ending some of the programs that helped to evacuate our American allies there. What do you think that says about our character now?
I think it's disappointing. I personally disagree with that decision, but I also think it sends a message. What about people who we ask to ally with us in the future, that we ask to partner with us? They look at what happens in the past. And so I think our national character should be bigger than that, and we're capable of being bigger than that.
General McChrystal, thank you very much for sharing your reflections.
You're kind to have me. Thank you.
And your book on character, Choices That Define a Life. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.